Hideo Kojima is someone I have admired for as long as I can remember. I adored the Metal Gear franchise up until 5, and I enjoyed some of his other outings such as Zone of the Enders 2. I love his bonkers form of storytelling that spawns 1,000 theory and conspiracy videos. I was pretty heartbroken by the whole Metal Gear Solid 5 debacle. I remember many late nights just watching trailers and breakdowns trying to spot any story clues I could, but when the game came out it was hollow. Its heart and soul had been kicked from the project before he could close the loop on his iconic franchise, and that's without even mentioning his revival of Silent Hill, which had everyone gripped after the incredible PT. After months of outrage, Kojima swaggered on stage during Sony's E3 conference and gave us our first look at his new game, Death Stranding. And in typical Kojima fashion, it was a whole bunch of nonsense, but it looked incredible, didn't it? In the following 3 years, I found myself falling in and out of love with the idea of the game for numerous reasons, but I wanted to believe in Kojima. He hadn't steered me wrong before. So when Death Stranding finally launched, a mere 3 years after its announcement, I dived in and I was underwhelmed. I found it meandering and honestly boring. I really liked the story beats I got and the main characters I encountered, but everything in between I just found cumbersome, and getting to listen to low roar while hiking through the admittedly beautiful world just wasn't enough for me. I needed more. I felt like if they cut the game down to mostly just the story beats, it would have benefited the game greatly. But rewind to October of 2020, and in my attempt to coerce my Game4All Podcast co-host Jordan to finally play Nier Automata, I promised that in return I would finally finish Death Stranding. So here goes nothing. Welcome to Eat Sleep Game. My name is Luke and I have been playing Death Stranding. Kojima has an almost unnatural ability to have one of the most visually stunning games at any given time, with character models that look as great as any of Kojima Productions' peers, even if they do sometimes look a little uncanny and slightly plasticky. But despite all of Kojima's characters being portrayed by noteworthy actors like Norman Reedus and Lea Seydoux, they are all somehow instantly recognizable as Kojima characters. Each and every character has been incredibly designed, from the ancient Egyptian stylings of Higgs and the perhaps not so subtle stitched together Deadman, to each of the BTs you can encounter, all being all-striking, making each boss encounter feel epic from the scale and intimidating design. Even Sam, who is the most bland of the character designs, still has a great level of attention to detail, from the way he wears his hair depending on whether you choose to don a hat or not, for example. I also really appreciate each upgrade to an item, weapon or reverse strike, as they have updated designs to reflect said upgrades, such as the long distance strike having battery packs where you would normally store extra cargo, or upgrading boots looking more heavy duty. Kojima not only puts a lot of thought into his stories, but into the character design too, and it really shines through here. All this being said, however, Death Stranding's short development time does peer through the cracks occasionally, most notably when talking to a hologram. Despite the fuzzy interface put over the top, it is still very clear that not much detail has been put into these characters, and the holographics are a way of hiding this, but it was still pretty noticeable given how much time you do spend interacting with said holograms. The world, while being pretty sparse, can be incredibly beautiful, from vast open fields framed with flowing rivers and grand tumbling waterfalls to snow-coated peaks and dilapidated crumbling structures. However, that's also my biggest complaint of Death Stranding's world. It's just so empty. I know there was a cataclysmic event, but the world just looks too clean. I expected to see more dilapidated structures. I expected a more Horizon Zero Dawn style of environment, with ruins cluttering a lot of the environment, and yet there's barely a trace of any kind of civilization at all. And despite the snowy peaks and volcanic areas, Death Stranding's world can get very samey due to this lack of anything in these albeit stunning environments. Again, this could be down to the short development time, but it really feels like there's something missing. There is so much talk of the destruction caused by both the Death Stranding and terrorist attacks, but you hardly ever see this on your travels. As a result, the game world lacks any real character of its own. There is so much story that can be told through the environment, and Death Stranding distinctly lacks this. For the main cast, voiceover is pretty great. Performances from the likes of Tommy Earl Jenkins, Lea Seydoux, Troy Baker, and Mads Mikkelsen take the often over-the-top and melodramatic dialogue and turn it into gold. The same unfortunately cannot be said for Norman Reedus. As much as I love the guy, he is at his best as an important side character. He is just so monotone and honestly dull as Sam. He makes it very difficult to care about the character or his journey, especially when he is interacting with the charisma levels of Higgs or Hartman, for example. Sound effects are pretty great, everything from the sound of wading through a body of water or waist high in snow to gunshots and small rock slides are all good quality 90% of the time. I do, however, take some issue with the use of music in Death Stranding. It feels like Kojima saw the way music was used in Red Dead Redemption 2 during pivotal journeys and liked them so much that he put 100 of the bloody things in this game. While in Red Dead Redemption 2 they carried a lot of weight, in Death Stranding they feel random a lot of the time, with music queuing in for no real reason, often halfway to a location and ending long before you reach said destination. I even had it a few times where the song seemed to come in too late and got cut off when I reached the destination before I was meant to. To me, the music would have been more effective if it was some sort of collectible like it was in Metal Gear Solid 5, and Sam could then be seen selecting a song for his travels. As is, they feel a bit like a last minute addition. Otherwise, music is used pretty well during cutscenes to accompany whatever situation is unfolding, even if that means it gets a little bit too melodramatic at points. Right, so in Death Stranding, you take control of Sam Porter Bridges, a porter or delivery boy who ends up working for Bridges and is called Sam. Right, he is tasked by Bridges and his dying mother, who is also the last president of the United Cities of America and the head of Bridges, to bring America together by delivering different items to people across the land, not only aiding them but also bringing them onto the chiral network, which will enable them to share information, resources and more. However, since the Death Stranding, the world is plagued by BTs, which are basically stranded souls, but luckily for us, Sam has dooms, which enables him to sense said BTs, who like to make delivering a little tense at points. Sam also inherits a BB, which is a baby in a bottle, that can enhance his dooms to help him or us see the BTs that he could previously only sense. In hindsight, it's not entirely clear if he can see them or if it's just the player, but that's besides the point. It is Sam's job to travel across America, making deliveries and bringing everyone online, and bring his maybe sister back home to take over Bridges from their dying, probably mother, and lead a new connected America. I think Death Stranding is a very, very difficult game to make sense of within a few sentences, and while I by no means think that it's Kojima's best work, it is still a pretty good story when it all comes together. Mostly. And I say mostly because, as I have hinted at, I feel like the game needed more time in the oven. There are a number of things in the story that make sense and link well, but there are also a number of things in the story that just come out of nowhere and do not add up, like certain characters actually being different characters that have world altering powers. That feels like a complete left turn when revealed, because unlike other reveals which are well seeded in the story, there is not a hint of foreshadowing for this. It feels like there are scenes missing at points. It doesn't help that for about half of the game very little gets any proper explanation, with a lot happening and just kind of being shrugged off, like the flashbacks for instance. As great as they are, and as incredibly important as they are to the overarching plot, they kind of come and go without seeming important at the time, despite how utterly bizarre they should be to everyone within the in-game logic. The writing in Death Stranding is very hit or miss. Often a good bit of dialogue is ruined by over-explaining or reiterating the same thing over and over, and yes, I get it, I need to check out my cufflinks. This is no more evident than the game spoiling what could have been an interesting plot point. Firstly, a package is given to Sam by hand from what is just clearly Troy Baker's Higgs, and then the game just straight up tells you that that package is a bomb. It would have been so much cooler if the game gave you none of this information until you had met with Fragile, but as is, it just feels like such a wasted chance at making the often bland and repetitive deliveries so much more interesting. As said, despite mostly being saved by great acting a lot of the time, the dialogue feels like it's been lifted straight out of a TV movie or daytime TV drama, and not a good one, often being overly melodramatic, and again this is in part due to storylines feeling like there are big chunks missing. Some characters can jump from rationality to hysteria before you've even caught up with what is actually being spoken about. Death Stranding is, however, genuinely full of great and interesting characters, from Mama, who is linked with a BT who is her miscarried child, to Hartman, who dies every 21 minutes in an attempt to find his deceased wife and child and join them. Not to mention Higgs and Fragile's rivalry and backstory being one of the highlights of the entire game, but Death Stranding criminally underuses each and every character apart from Higgs, who you expect to see a little bit less of given that he is the antagonist, and he's honestly built up pretty well. His aura is served pretty justifiably. As a result, a lot of the time emotional moments just do not resonate with me because we don't spend enough time with the people these moments are attached to. For a game about bringing people together, we don't spend long enough with people to connect with them outside of a few of the core characters. Another example of Death Stranding's poor writing is the game's over-reliance on telling you about important events or situations rather than showing you them. From the ludicrous number of emails you receive during the game, and while a lot of them are just nothing, a fair few of them have important hints as to what you need to do next, or some clever reveals, all of which can be missed because Death Stranding expects you to spend an inordinate amount of time doing nothing but reading some pretty dull emails. Or for instance, how much more impactful would learning about the bombing of Middle Knot City be if it was through a cutscene and seeing all of the chaos and destruction instead of just hearing a story from Deadman? There is so much more beyond what Death Stranding shows you, and it is lost either in lengthy dialogue with little explanation or hidden away amongst the dozens of emails you're expected to sift through. The biggest crime of Death Stranding, however, is the pacing. Dear particle of God, the pacing is just horrendous. It is true that it takes around 7 hours to actually progress the story beyond the opening setup, and then it's another 30 odd hours of being drip fed bits and pieces of the narrative and character stories until you actually hit that 40-hour mark and get to the final third, which has all the story you have been waiting for, but it's over in about 4 or 5 hours. There was genuinely a point during my playthrough where I was further into the game than I had ever gotten in my previous 2 attempts, and I was so excited to see where the story took me next and what would unfold, and I shit you not, the entire day following I got zero story, none, just hours of meandering and plodding delivery boy dullness, delivering package to some of Kojima's friends and not pushing the narrative forward at all. It was infuriating. Genuinely, the game could be half the length and it would be so much of an improvement, but as it is, so much of the story doesn't make sense for so long because the pacing is so bad. By the time you get to the next story beat, you've forgotten what the last one was and why you're in the middle of a snowstorm with a baby strapped to your chest. Gameplay is tricky for me to define, in that I really do like a number of things that Death Stranding does, but the lack of diversity and substance to keep these things interesting makes a number of them go from interesting concepts to meandering and often meaningless filler. Building suffers the most in this regard, as there are a good number of different structures that in isolation are actually pretty useful. Post boxes allow you to store and share items and lost cargo with other players and them with you, but I never really found that I was carrying enough or in desperate need for something that was inside one of these post boxes to really ever bother with them. Watchtowers give you the ability to scan and survey the surrounding area and highlight points of interest from collectibles and cargo to enemies and locations. And these watchtowers were the most useless structure alongside the safe houses, as I never found a real need for either throughout my playthrough. Conversely, generators and ziplines were some of the more useful of these. Generators were especially of use when I was on a long journey and in need of a quick recharge for my reverse trike or exoskeleton to get me through the rest of my journey. And the ziplines made what would have been a long and boring trek a short and often beautiful trip sailing through, past and over the picturesque world of Death Stranding. Timefall shelters are meant to give some respite when your journey finds you stuck in a downpour, but honestly, the only use I ever really found for these was the container repair spray that would coat you once you were under the shelter. However, I found that no matter how many times I skipped time or how long I waited, Timefall would never let up, so I rarely ever felt the need to build one of these for myself. Bridges and roads are probably the most frustrating, as they are the two most important and useful structures, but they both take so many materials it can take so long to find the correct amount. And in the time spent searching, most of the time I'd found an alternate way to my destination. On the whole, despite having some usefulness, building feels pretty pointless. The majority are just not needed for you to progress, and once you have connected an area to the chiral network, other players have built all that you could ever need. I genuinely believe that the building mechanic could have been better served had it been more intrinsically tied to helping people in an area. And the more you help, the stronger their connection got, and the more the surrounding area would be rebuilt. As is though, the whole mechanic kind of just feels like filler, and it's a shame because so much more could be done with it. Death Stranding's main mechanic outside of walking is balance, and it becomes tiresome pretty quickly. I fully understand the idea behind it, but it just feels really poorly implemented to me. Over encumbrance is such an annoying mechanic on its own, and while I do like how it makes you really think about what you would need to take out with you, it also led me to often dropping other mechanics such as the building altogether. Sam's constant weight shifting and stumbling around gets infuriating in a very short amount of time, especially when there seems to be no reason for it. I could be walking along a flat bit of land with no obstruction in the way, and Sam would still wildly lose his balance and stumble all over the place like he's had way too much to drink. This again makes Death Stranding feel somewhat undercooked. There are so many good ideas in the gameplay, but a lot of them cancel out other mechanics, and they just needed to be more thoughtful. All that being said, despite its meandering nature, traversal is one big puzzle in Death Stranding. I quite like the waypointing mechanic. It makes waypointing that much more interesting, trying to find the quickest route while having to take into account the surrounding areas and safety, instead of just your standard placing a marker and being led to that direction. That being said, I really wish that your previous travels didn't still show up on the map. It makes it look so messy and makes plotting your next journey that bit more difficult. This is also another mechanic that, while being a good idea, feels pretty half-baked because you can't really see the terrain on the map all that well, so I often found that I would lead myself to an insurmountable mountain and have to just reroute on the fly, and eventually I just resorted to placing that standard marker on my destination and working out the rest as and when. Vehicles can be an absolute godsend, a great break from plodding around the map. A godsend, that is, when they aren't trying to buck you like a mechanical ball or getting stuck on the smallest bit of debris. While they can be a lot of fun, they kind of handle a lot like the Mako from Mass Effect 1, often veering off at the slightest touch. Combat, on the other hand, is so interesting. A dead body will cause a massive cataclysmic explosion known as a void out, so guns or any other kind of lethal force is off of the table. Other than hand-to-hand combat, rope are your best friend, using them in different ways to incapacitate your enemies, be it sneaking up behind them and choking them out, or eventually being able to tie them up from a distance with the bowler gun. I really like the thought put into finding ways around incapacitating enemies without being fatal. I also like how, with slight modifications, similar tactics can be used on BTs. This approach to combat keeps things interesting for me, opposed to the simpler option of just shooting everything like many other games take. The give and take of having to use your blood as a weapon against BTs is a clever one, having to both defeat the enemy but take care that you don't defeat yourself in doing so. The BT boss fights are a highlight of the game for me. They feel so different to most other games. The lack of direct combat, the way you have to clamber and climb to a vantage point to take your shot before the BT catches or attacks, the spectacle of the encounter, the setup beforehand. Kojima just knows how to set up a boss fight scene better than almost anyone in the game today. It is just a shame that the other BT encounters feel so limp in comparison. The sections where you have to sneak and tiptoe around BTs very quickly goes from tense to frustrating because they are just in the way. And this goes doubly when you do eventually gain the ability to defeat BTs without having to engage with their monstrous forms. You unlock the ability to cut cords with your cufflink. And while this does test your guts, because you have to get up very close and personal to a BT to cut their cord, it's also pretty overpowered, so sure, you might get caught before cutting a cord, but I found there was rarely any difficulty when circumnavigating BTs, nor really in defeating them should I get caught, which just makes them feel far less intimidating and strips away so much of the aura that the game does build up for them. When there is no other option but to get into it with the Tusken Raider-like mules, who are rogue porters, hand-to-hand combat feels pretty good. There is a good weight to all of your attacks, and it feels pretty scrappy as you'd realistically expect from someone like Sam. Eventually you will gain automatic weapons, but again, using lethal force is a bad idea, so non-lethal weaponry is your friend. However, I found that combat was far more interesting when guns were just not involved, especially in terms of using bowler gun to tie up enemies rather than using the glorified beanbag gun to incapacitate foes. It just didn't feel right having Sam take hold of a more traditional firearm when everything else to this point has been so much more thoughtful. There are so many small changes I want this game to make its repetitive gameplay loop feel rewarding. Some of these include making the porter grades simpler to understand and giving you more tangible upgrades. Just lift the same mechanic from Persona 5 and stick it in here. I do not care about being able to give more likes in a 5-second period, but I do care about an increased carry capacity. As is, the porter grade means very little to me, as do each point on the star. Cargo condition and delivery time make complete sense to me, as does delivery volume, being how much you carry, but I'm still not clear on what a bridge link is or what it does when it's upgraded. And why is one point literally labeled miscellaneous? Each of these points should be tangible goals to work towards. They should be clear and give you clear rewards in return for putting the time into each section of the star. I do appreciate being rewarded for how you actually play rather than playing a certain way to increase these rewards, but it needs to be clearer what it is you are doing well at. Miscellaneous tells me absolutely nothing. Another change, as said, would be to put more importance into building. For instance, if all the extra deliveries you do were to help acquire materials for the region's base to redevelop the roads and whatnot, instead of being solely based on your convenience. This in turn would also give the side missions more importance, as the more stars you get, the stronger your network gets, and the more then gets rebuilt, making getting from point A to point B so much easier. And on a similar note, this would also make actually getting those 5 stars on each location more worthwhile. I cannot put into words how frustrating it was to put the effort to get 5 stars in the first UCA base, to only be rewarded with a sticky star on my overalls. I genuinely wanted and kept getting the urge to get 5 stars on each base, but I was so burnt and so stung by that first one that I didn't want to waste my time. That first 5 stars should give you something great to encourage you to keep pushing with the rest, but instead I was left burnt and resorted to only picking up lost cargo if it was on my way to a destination. Death Stranding wants to encourage you to do all that you can to help those around you, but the game gives you so little as an incentive. I don't care about the likes. I don't get what they do beyond increase your porter rank, which means very, very little to me. I don't care about interacting with all of Kojima's friends. I don't care about the novelty otter hat when the other rewards have burned me. I also really don't need a mini cutscene for everything. For example, the Odra deck popping up to let me know that I have to be careful because there are BTs around. I am positive that I would notice it without the overly dramatic slow motion for the 100th time, or getting on and off a trike, or picking up anything. It just makes the game feel that more padded out to me. I get it for the first time you are interacting with an object to show its importance, but it genuinely put me off interacting with so much because it just wasted so much time. And why does everything have to stop your momentum? And one final thing, each distribution center you wander into states how it is home to thousands of people. So where are they? I would have loved it if each of these buildings were treated like vaults from Fallout and had different and interesting people, maybe even some quest givers to interact with, and lore to be unearthed about each building and area. But this again it feels like another sacrifice of the short time Death Stranding spent in development. This could have made the empty world make more sense had you seen the population hiding underground, and would have made your efforts so much more rewarding have they resurfaced when the area had been renovated. Being able to see the people, families and communities that you were potentially saving could have made so much difference in the big, empty, vapid world of Death Stranding. In terms of performance, I cannot fault Death Stranding. Aside from some small amount of environmental pop-in, a few patches of poor or maybe unloaded textures, and the very, very occasional long loading pause, it ran pretty well. And granted, this may have been helped by me playing on the PS5, but either way, it was a pretty solid playthrough, although I did have to restart the game after getting stuck on some rocks for a few minutes while a BT was trying to pull me in. Death Stranding is a pretty hollow game with delusions of grandeur. It talks a big game but never follows through on its promise of a grand journey. Just a meandering, unfulfilling story with underutilized and underdeveloped characters that deserved more attention. Right up until that 40-hour mark, where the story is finally coerced out of his little cave and all of Jake's delicious spaghetti is out of the can. And go and check out the Easily Game Podcast episode 1 if you didn't get that reference. There is so much I really love about Death Stranding, but it feels like I have to fight the game so hard to get to those points, be it interesting characters, the approach to combat and subsequent boss fights, or even a little of the damn story that ultimately, when I do get what I've been waiting for, it's unfulfilling. As I've mentioned, if this game was half the length, it would help so much. I love Kojima and his style of storytelling, but I wish someone would tell him that his linear storytelling just does not fit in an open world. His strengths are with grand narratives, interesting and wildly out there characters, but not with world building. The world of Death Stranding is big and certainly beautiful, but little more. I truly believe that had Death Stranding been an open area style game such as The Last of Us or God of War, where you help people in a certain area and then move on to the next, it would have benefited the game and the story so much more than the open world does. Imagine, if you will, a more linear style of game where you go from city to city and each of those cities slowly gets rebuilt the more you progress the story in the area and the more you further help NPCs with their side questing. And then when you finally reach the other side of America and have to travel all the way back for the end game, the world opens up and becomes an open world, and your grand Red Dead Redemption 2 journey becomes more straightforward the more you have helped people in each city and the more of each city has been rebuilt. Not only showing people working together once again, but giving you your tangible reward for all of your work and giving you that open world to fulfill all of your delivery boy dreams, instead of traveling from one end of the country only to find that you have to travel all the way back to the beginning and finding that everything you have built has been reset because of the stupid timefall, making it all the time you have put into building roads and structures to make your life easier pointless. This would also give more time to the underused characters, and they could all be located in different cities, giving them a full chapter to explore their backstories and understand them in much greater detail than the negligibly short amount of time that we do get currently. Not only to mention making the story more digestible and cohesive, as it would be given to you more consistently. Death Stranding is the most infuriating game I have ever played, not in that it is difficult, nor even a wholly bad game. It is in fact the opposite. Now I've rolled credits, I have a much deeper appreciation of the game's story, general gameplay, and especially its characters. The reason Death Stranding is so frustrating is because it feels like I'm having to fight against the boring, repetitive fetch questing and deliveries that, other than meeting a different character, have really no bearing on the story whatsoever, nor do they have any kind of challenge. Death Stranding can take some very cool concepts like spooky enemies that you can't see or inventory and balance management and make them tedious through mindless repetition to the point of not caring. There is so little motivating me in the long stretches between story beats that I just couldn't care less about what it was I am delivering or which of Kojima's friends it was to. I just wanted to progress the story and make sense of why I was doing this. Despite all that I enjoyed about the game and my love for the classic Kojima style story caked in deeper meaning and relatable through lines, especially in the current pandemic, I don't honestly know a single person I would recommend this game to. I would recommend watching some kind of abridged playthrough with all the cutscenes, boss fights and some key gameplay sections, but I cannot recommend that anyone play a game that takes 7 hours to get going and a further 40 to get really interesting, which is a shame because when it does finally get interesting, Death Stranding is all of the game I hoped it could be.